we need to do a little bit of a review here. I want to make sure we don't lose sight of the big picture. So we're going to do a quick flyover review of where we've been the last few weeks.
Yes, sir.
We started out by acknowledging that some things about us are not changeable, and acknowledging at the same time that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and thanking God for the way He made us. And we had a story about a woman named Amy Carmichael who was praying that God would give her blue eyes, and then years later recognized that there was a good reason for her to have brown eyes. Remember this story? We talked about one of these unchangeable things being our past, how we can't time travel, we can't go back and fix things that we messed up in the past. But God, one of the things that He does is redeems the past. And we had a story about a man named John Newton who was a slave trader, and God redeemed him. And he's the guy who actually ended up writing the song Amazing Grace. And then we talked about butterflies, about how we start out as one kind of creature, and then God's intent for us is that we become a different kind of creature. And we cannot make ourselves into butterflies, but God changes us when we trust Jesus and ask Him to do that. Then we talked about not changing to the world's pattern, not being conformed to the world's pattern. And we talked about candle wax being poured into a mold, and then the mold telling it what to become, and how important it is for us to not be poured into the world's mold. And then last week we started talking about being transformed by the renewing of our minds. We talked about the streets, about how the base layer has to be torn up for the new pavement to be solid, and how our minds work the same way, how we need to tear out the base layer so that we can rebuild the way we think, and about how important it is to get rid of the big lie, the lie that says life is about me. But before we move on, I want to make sure you have a chance to have some discussion about where we've been. So spend a few minutes talking about these things, and then we'll pick up where we left off. You can see that out here on 12th Street, they're still working on the base. They got the old stuff already all dug out, and they're putting this new stuff down, getting it packed in really nice and tight so everything above it will be solid. Here on Pennsylvania Avenue, you can see that they've got the base pretty much ready to go. You can tell because they put this seal coat of oil on top of it. But look how solid this is. Now, it's not as smooth as the pavement is going to be, of course, but that's okay. The point of the base is not the smoothness, it's the solidness. It's how sturdy the base is. And you can see all the way down Pennsylvania, they'll be paving pretty soon because they've got this base ready to go. Now, I know some of you are already jumping ahead here, and you're asking the next question, which is good. Now, it's going to take a while for us to keep digging out the lie, but we should go ahead and ask the question, then what do we put down instead? If we're tearing out a big lie, is there a big truth then that becomes the base layer of the way we think? Well, the short answer is yes, I think there is a base layer that changes the way we think about everything. And in order for me to explain this base layer to you, I need to tell you a story about Jesus. Now, we don't have a lot of stories about Jesus as a youth, as a teenager. We have extensive reports about his birth, and even the first couple of years of his life, there are some stories. And then we have a lot of stories about him later in his life, from when he's about 30 years old until his death and resurrection. But in between, there's just not a lot of stuff. There's really only one story about Jesus being a teenager. Actually, in this story, he's 12 years old, but that would be very much comparable to being a teenager in today's world. You can find this story in Luke chapter 2. It starts with Jesus' parents taking him on a trip. They take this trip every year. They're going from their hometown of Nazareth to the city of Jerusalem. Now, there's a distance here of about 70 miles, which is kind of like from here to San Angelo. except that they're traveling on foot. So this takes 4 or 5 days, and they travel in this large group of people to Jerusalem. They're going there for a festival. They're going there for the Passover festival, and they do this every year. And at the end of the festival, all of the people who traveled from Nazareth start to go back home. And they've been on the road for about a day before they realize that Jesus is not with them. I think it must have been one of those situations of, I thought he was with you. No, I thought he was with you. Well, the group is apparently large enough that you can not know if all the people are actually there in the group, and they figure out that 12-year-old Jesus is not with them anymore. So his mom and dad go back to Jerusalem to look for him. And even once they get there, Jerusalem's a pretty big city, and so they spend some time looking for him. It takes them 2 more days just to find him. So Jesus has been missing for 3 days. Now, if you think about this from his parents' perspective, you can understand why they would be upset. His mom is very upset. If you were missing for 3 days, there would be people who would be upset that you were missing as well. So anyway, they find him in the temple. And the first thing mom says is, "How could you do this to us? Didn't you know we were looking for you?" Well, what has Jesus been doing all this time? Did he just ditch his parents? Was he even aware that they were going to be upset? What we know is this. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. So not only has Jesus been apparently in the temple for 3 days, they're also very impressed with him. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. So stop and think about this for a minute. Evidently, 12-year-old Jesus has been extensively studying the scriptures. He knows them so well that all the teachers are impressed by him. And he's so interested in learning about the scriptures and talking about the scriptures that in addition to the festival, 3 more days have gone by with him just talking with the guys about what do the scriptures say. And when Jesus' mom shows up and she's upset, Jesus actually asks her questions. He says to her, "Why were you looking for me?" And then he says this, "Didn't you know I had to be about my Father's business?" Now, I don't think Jesus is being disrespectful here. I think he genuinely is confused about why his mother is so upset. Well, what does Jesus mean by this? What is so important to him? Why has 12-year-old Jesus apparently ignored everything else in his life just so he could spend this time with the teachers? I must be about my Father's business. One thing, at least, is clear. Jesus has not bought into the lie that life is about him. Jesus has already replaced this lie with some kind of big truth. So stay with me now. We need to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. We need to change the way we think. We need to stop believing that life is about us. But then what are we replacing that with? We're going to use Jesus' words. We must be about our Father's business. This becomes the new base layer of all of our thinking. Life is not about me, it's about God and what He's doing. Can you see how this changes everything? If at the bottom of everything it's not about me, but it's about God, then everything else is going to change. But what does it actually mean? What is Jesus talking about, his Father's business? Well, let's see if we can figure out what the business of the Father actually is. Here are a couple of things to get us started. God is in the business of restoring things to how they should be. You can look around and see that there are a lot of broken things around us, can't you? We talk about this all the time. God is in the business of restoring things to how they ought to be. And more importantly, God is in the business of restoring relationships, especially the relationship between us and Him. By now, I think we can all agree that the relationship between us and God has been severely damaged. And Jesus came to restore that relationship. This is the Father's business that Jesus is talking about. Restored relationship between God and people. So what about us? How do we make this the base layer of our thinking? is it even possible for us to think about all of life in terms of being about the Father's business? Really, I think for today, we're going to have to be satisfied with just asking these two questions and wrestling with them. Now, like a lot of the things that we talk about, you don't just find the solution here in this conversation. You don't just talk on Wednesday night about it and then go about doing your regular business the rest of the days of the week. How do we change the way we think so that we're constantly thinking about the Father's business instead of life being about us? Well, these are the two questions that I think we need to ask. One, where can I see God at work? Now, this might be at school. You might be seeing God at work in relationships, in your friends, in your teachers. In your own mind, you might be seeing God at work. Remember, God is about restoration. So if you see relationships that need restoration, then God is about the business of restoring those relationships. And especially if you see people who need their relationship with God restored, well, that's all of us, right? That's the business that God is in. Where do we see God at work? And then the second question is this: how can we join him in this work? Now, I recognize that these are very abstract kinds of thoughts. So I want you in your groups to spend some time being more specific about where do you see God at work in restoration and how can we join him? And then next week when we get together, we'll spend some time talking about that from what the scriptures have to say about it.